working on this toolkit. And yeah, we're just so excited to kind of finally present it to all of you. Next slide, please. So I've been doing this with a couple different COEs, but in large part, Amanda from Mendocino, who I know a lot of you have seen before, she did a huge amount of work on this. So, I mean, huge shout out to her. I feel like she did the bulk of the work in large part, and I was just kind of supporting on the ends around it. But yeah, she dove into this and really put a lot of pieces into it. What we kind of focused on when Amanda and I first started meeting around this was like, a lot of times DHCS is sort of pointing us back to like, for documentation practices, we want you to follow best practices from various boards or associations. So we thought like, well, let's try to go to all those different resources and compile it all in one location for all the different service providers under the fee schedule. So that way it's easier for all of you. If you're like, hey, I'm thinking about starting to bill under this role, for the fee schedule, like what are documentation practices out there? And so we started gathering as much as we could. Yeah, Amanda, what would you like to say to that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo what you said. I probably wouldn't add too much other than I think that was just prompted by the ever clicking on the fee schedule manual and just really, again, having worked in specialty mental health and in schools and like just that kind of combination. It's confusing. It's all the information is confusing. And when they don't have something direct, it was really hard to then sift through documents. And so I think my goal also was to make sure that we had a central document where we or myself or whoever had gone into those documents that the fee schedule then links you to and pulled out the information that we thought was most helpful or informational or directive. So that way, hopefully you didn't have to. We obviously encourage you to do so and feel free to go down that rabbit hole. But we tried to highlight some of the biggest pieces, I think, from the questions that all of our teams were having.
Great, thanks so much. All right, next slide. So just some important framing for all of you as you're looking at the toolkit. Thanks, Sienna, for dropping the toolkit in the chat so folks can start looking at it. None of this is direct guidance from us. So just to be clear, this is all guidance that we're gathering from like DHCS, CMS, BBS, like various different organizations out there. We're just kind of all gathering in one location. So this isn't direct guidance from us in any way. It's just kind of a collaborative resource. It's a living document. So we did not flesh out several different service providers. You may see in there things like physician assistant. We haven't really done anything to that beyond the basic stuff that's out there. We would love if all of you would actually reach out to us at Capacity Grants. And I'm happy to take time to dig into different service provider types. If you are thinking about diving into one of the ones we haven't fleshed out as much, yeah, happy to dig into that more too. I just didn't want to spend a bunch of time on provider types that maybe folks aren't really using as much, if that wasn't helpful. And then just to acknowledge there's certain service provider types out there that don't really have a lot of guidance. So like wellness coaches or PPS school counselors, there's really not a lot of direct documentation guidance out there. So that's something that Capacity Grants we're really being intentional about too. So we're partnering with CYBHI to think through different documentation pieces for wellness coaches. We're meeting with CAS to get some better guidance around various different practices as well. So it's something we are working on in the background and trying to gather resources as we can, but right now there's not a lot out there. Yeah, next slide, please. So maybe for folks who might be newer to this world of documenting school-based behavioral health services, we thought it might be helpful to just briefly ground in some of the importance of documentation. So maybe to give you more framing too, when I was part of the local team, I co-led the documentation committee for pretty much the 5 years I was in the local program. And particularly in the beginning years, there was a lot of work we were doing around developing documentation practices. And a lot of the pieces that we really focused on were like things like accountability. So like proof that you're meeting the criteria for billed services, as well as meeting all the standards of care in order to prepare for any potential audits. This is a big one. Audit concerns is something we've talked about a lot in this space, and really trying to have the best documentation practices possible is one of the main ways you can prepare for any potential audit. Liability, if records were ever subpoenaed, particularly around a crisis situation, thorough documentation is really crucial to proving that you did all that you could. Even for like non-clinical roles, like a wellness coach, there might still be a situation where a student they're with might be going into a crisis situation. So making sure that they're thoroughly documenting, handing off that student to a high level of care is really important around liability concerns. So data-driven advocacy is another great one. Numbers, notes, data, all these things really support helping others understand why the programs we all run are super important and should be funded. So it's another great way we can kind of advocate for these things. And then, of course, continuity of care is a really important piece as well. So strong documentation practices support when we transfer students to different service providers, when students move from one area to another. Having that thorough documentation is super supportive and helpful to them in changing providers. So the kind of truism that's out there in the documentation world, if y'all haven't heard it, if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. Next slide, please. Cool. So I think this quote is maybe from Amanda. I really loved this quote. Thanks, Amanda, for sharing it.
Chat Gemini. I can't take all of the credit. Gemini helped me put it together.
It was great. I really love this. Yeah, right. Every note as if it'll one day be read out loud in a courtroom with the heart of someone who wants the best for the child. Yeah. AI is like coming up with good stuff, I guess. Okay, so next slide. So just to briefly kind of orient you, it sounds like some of you are already looking at it. So if you haven't like gotten into Google Docs as like deeply before, if y'all are maybe not used to using it as much, there's a document tabs you can pull up on the left. And if you're able to pull it up, you could then navigate through the different tabs. And so we have the intro and table of contents in that first tab, where we talk a little bit about the framing of the document, some pieces that don't really fit anywhere. We kind of also put in there. And then you can go down by the different service provider types. And we lumped in like LCSW and ASW, like ones that made sense to lump in together, we lumped in. But yeah, hopefully that's helpful for you in terms of navigating. Next slide, please. So I thought it might be fun too to highlight some pieces. Like as I was like preparing for this presentation, there were like some things in there I was like, oh man, like this is super important to flag for folks. One, that kind of came up during the BBS presentation a couple months ago was like, wait, is notice to clients required in the school setting? And so it is. Like we found a notice from BBS that specifically said that if a registrant underneath them is providing services of any kind in any setting, they're required to give a notice to clients to the clients they're working with. And so while this is ultimately on the clinician in the field, it's common this is included in the consent to treat form. And then another piece that also I noticed was that BBS requires that providers they oversee maintain records for 7 years after the client turns 18. So even though within y'all's PPAs or on the fee schedule, it says 10 years records retention, it's good to realize that like if you have BBS folks that you are working with, that you'll maybe have to retain records for even longer. So just important to remember that. And then there's also a lot of questions I know out there around PBS school counselors. And so within this documentation toolkit, we linked all the different resources we've gotten from them during their presentation and things like that. Okay, cool. Well, I'd love to turn it over to you, Amanda, for the next portion. So you can kind of present on the ways that you've thought about this locally within Mendocino.
Awesome. I'm going to share my screen. Make sure you can all see it. You can all see my screen, documentation and note writing. Perfect. Okay. So with this, in doing the documentation toolkit and kind of creating these different pieces, why I wanted to do at MCOE in Mendocino County was to make sure that we had some semi-tangible tools or examples that people could reference given their different provider types in terms of notes. And so our goal with the documentation toolkit too, also like Patrick said, is that if you are already utilizing different notes or templates and you're willing to share that, please do. We would love to have something where we can then reference examples, right? Because not one note template is going to fit for everything. And so the approach that I've taken with MCOE and our providers and our mental health providers across the consortia in general, regardless of program, but also kind of related to some CYBHI specifics, is I put together just a very brief view of documentation, note writing best practices based off my own experience, but also based off of the information found from CAMPT and AMFT and other boards and things like that. And so one thing that I like to preface is that, and we'll get to some of the questions that have come up, is, that this is the way that we have viewed it is we are going from whatever our highest standard of documentation is in best practices, and kind of working our way down. So like with that preface to be able to say that, right, a licensed practitioner's note might look different and probably should look different a little bit, right, than a certified wellness coach. And so, however, what I've put together are just some general best practices for what we've shared out. It's been received really well from our counselors that we've had in terms of having a baseline. So you will have access to this. So I won't go over every single detail that's in here, but I will kind of highlight a few things. Let me advance to the next slide. So I always go over and just review when I'm studying the framework. I won't do this with you, right? But we know what CYBHI is and what CYBHI covers and identifies those categories. With that, I also identified these other pieces of the health insurance information, the consent to bill, the consent to treat, just to highlight these are these kind of foundational pieces that we need then in order to document, because this is also a part of documentation and making sure we have what we need. I also then highlight for them the workflow. So asking from providers, what is needed from our providers? Because that is a big question. That's a big question we've had pushback from our LEAs, our superintendents, right? Like what is actually needed when it comes to implementing this initiative and how do we make that happen? And so kind of just giving a roadmap of identifying, first off, what are the services that we are already offering and that we are providing, and which ones will fit under the fee schedule and what are we looking for reimbursement for? That next step is then identifying those students who we are serving and then collecting that insurance information, collecting the consents like I showed on the previous screen. And then this part is where we come in and we say, okay, now we have those pieces, we're providing the service, we need to document those services. So like Patrick highlighted before, a part of the toolkit, right? We just kind of, I like to highlight again, why is it important? Because we often, again, for some of us who, like for a licensed provider, a lot of that training-ish, I say ish, depending on your program, is implemented into your curriculum in terms of your grad school, in terms of whatever that is. There's on-the-job training. But what we found going through this process is that when it came to anybody who was non-licensed, it is not in their curriculum. It is not in their training for documentation. Progress notes are not even terminology per se for many of those programs because historically it hasn't been a big thing. Documentation is important, but in terms of progress notes and writing to insurance and things like that, it just hasn't been a thing. And so with this new landscape and changing landscape, a big piece that we wanted to highlight was why should our providers who maybe aren't documenting or aren't documenting in as much detail, why is this important? The few things that we highlighted are just continuity of care. So if you have multiple providers, especially with CYBHI, you have different providers meeting with the student. It might be nice, depending on our locations and our landscape, as to being able to have people who are working with those children and students know what happened in different sessions potentially, right? Like there's pros and cons to that. But in general, there's some continuity of care with that amongst providers. So we know what's going on with our kids, especially in those areas where maybe we don't have as much crossover or time to collaborate. Notes can be a really great tool for that. It also helps inform our decision-making when working with students and families. It helps us monitor progress. And really the goal, right, is to improve that client care and outcomes. And then there's the legal and side of it, right, which is the regulatory compliance, making sure we're meeting HIPAA FERPA compliance, making sure we're meeting Medi-Cal or other insurance compliance. It also provides the provider, but also the school with some legal protections. If we're documenting it and we're showing that what we're doing and we're supporting these students and something happens, we can come back and say, hey, this was the chain of events that happened. And so it can provide some legal protections. And then, sorry, let me move this out. This also then at the end of the day, especially with CYBHI and other programs, leads to accurate billing. It leads to less recoupment on the back end in terms of Medi-Cal coming back and saying, hey, we're not going to bill for this, we're not going to cover this. And again, the goal is to bring in those additional fundings for our students. So the documentation, as much as it might be a nightmare sometimes, is such a crucial part in a lot of different areas when working with students. These are just some different documentation examples that I kind of go through because we document in all sorts of different types of ways. And then what I also highlight is just some best practices and some formatting examples. And so I'll just highlight that DHCS has verbally stated in their office hours that SOAP notes are perfectly okay standard to be able to utilize. And then in conversation, depending on who your EHR is or depending on what your school's policy or ideas are. I also give some other examples of a BERT format, which is more behavior intervention response plan, or a GIRP, which is the goal intervention response plan. And something that came up, I believe it might have been Jen when I had a conversation with her recently, is highlighting that like a SOAP note for some of us who are licensed makes sense, but maybe for those who are not or who don't have the training in diagnosing or assess or things like that, the SOAP notes and the DAP notes can feel a little bit too clinical. And so using maybe a BERP note or a GIRP note might be a good idea to start because its focus is more on a behavior. It might focus more on a goal in an intervention and a response versus the actual assessment of things. So I just like to kind of highlight that as there's a bunch of different examples that we can use. And then what I do in the training is I go over each of these examples. I won't go over these today just because you'll have access to these. You can review them. And again, some of these are taken from CAMPT in their training. It's kind of a combination of different examples out there. But I do list out and give them some tangible language that might be utilized in the different note examples. So here's a GIRP note example. The SOAP notes, again, with the left column showing what goes in that section. The right side is just examples of what you might state verbiage-wise. And again, examples of DAP notes. I also like to pause and highlight 2 crisis notes. And I want to give a shout out to Butte County. They have a really great tool related to one of their programs. And it highlighted just some really important things that I thought were great in the sense of when we're documenting crisis notes. Again, like Patrick said, ideally, we're getting a provider connected or a student connected to the appropriate provider. But if you have a certified wellness coach who is navigating and doing those warm handoffs or whatever that might be, they also need to understand the importance of the crisis notes and why we need to document these, again, for all those reasons I mentioned before. So they're just some highlighted pieces distinguishing the difference between a crisis note and maybe a regular note that we might write under the fee schedule. And then some best practice suggestions. This is just in general for any of the providers that are serving this. And so what I always like to say is like, keep it factual, keep it clear and concise, and date and time tracked, right? So there's some claiming stuff with that, but I think there's also, again, just best practice is it helps to keep our judgments out of things. It helps to, again, keep our focus on the student, on our goals and what's going on. That then includes using first-person language, really stigma-free language, right? Instead of saying someone is schizophrenic, we might say someone who is struggling with schizophrenia, right? Like that's just a really broad example, but making sure we're really focused on the person and the student because that's who we're serving. And I think keeping that at the forefront also helps guide how we might write notes. Use clinical or professional but neutral language, right, for behavior, symptoms, or goals. So describing their actions, again, staying out of judgments or clinical assessments sometimes might be a great place to just start. Ensure that you have a golden thread, so making sure that your assessment leads to maybe a treatment plan behind the scenes, which then matches what you are actually documenting and writing to in your progress notes. I always encourage to maintain confidentiality and apply that minimum necessity rule just in the sense of don't give extra information if it's not needed, right? Remembering that should those notes get pulled somewhere or subpoenaed, that all of what is in there is there. And although we might redact some of that information, they can always come back and request that information. So being minimal, not necessarily naming names unless it's appropriate and needed, again, because if you include parent information, that information, again, can be shared. It's not just the student information. Avoid including identifying information of third parties. Again, I just mentioned that. And then practice concurrent note writing is something that we strongly encourage, meaning writing notes during a session. I myself have issues sometimes with writing notes during a session, but I practice very firmly writing notes right after a session or as soon as I'm able. Because, right, we know in the school setting, you might see 15, 20 kids in a day for different reasons or more. And so that gets really jumbled really fast in the terms of what you did in those sessions. And so if we can practice writing it more concretely and more efficiently and more quickly, it helps overall. And then just some kind of common questions and things that have come up that I'll end on. Again, I don't want to take too much time, but I'm also happy to answer any questions in our follow-up. Is that one big piece that has come up is just the reticence of providers to document in general. And so especially those who maybe don't have experience working with insurance or don't have not had to document in detail through LEA BOP or other programs. The biggest piece is like, well, if I'm already doing this and I'm not changing anything, why do I need to document it? So, it's going to take a lot of time. There's going to be all this paperwork. We have to get consents and things that maybe to the level we didn't have to get to before. And so again, just recognizing like, again, yeah, historically validating them. They haven't had to do this, right? There's landscapes, the landscape is changing. But at the end of the day, you're not doing anything different. You're continuing to provide those supports for your student. The upside is you get to be reimbursed for that in a way that we didn't get reimbursed for before. So really highlighting that link of how they are supporting their programs, their students, again, what the LEA does with that unrestricted funding, that's like those conversations. I encourage them to take that back to their teams and their admin and have those conversations, but really helping them understand why this extra piece, potentially extra in some situations, is needed. And then kind of recognizing that with the right training, which is why we do the trainings, that documentation doesn't have to be this long 10-minute note that you're writing for every student. There can be processes and procedures and kind of like tools and tricks that we can utilize to make it easier. I know our EHR has like a copy paste-ish function where you can copy previous notes, right, and save time and change language. And so I think it's all about navigating those individual questions with the providers. And that has seemed, at least with our providers, has kind of taken away some of the anxiety or apprehension around doing that. And then again, just understanding the need for the documentation. And then at the end of the day, one is just supporting that, documentation supports reducing that fear of audits and liability. Because if you have everything documented the way it should be, there's less issues that might come from that. And bottom line, right? I guess it's not here on the slide, but what I've also had conversations with is at the end of the day, in a really gentle way, if we can find a way to navigate that conversation, is this is also, making sure that we can support funding for the really important positions that we have, our own positions, right? That if we are doing this and we're needing these supports, we know in our landscape right now that behavioral health services and mental health is often being cut. And trying to scramble for ways to find funding for that and really helping them understand this is an avenue potentially for funding and reimbursement. And again, it's to keep those services where it needs to be, which is with our students and our families, and making sure that those providers are in our schools where they need to be. So in a nutshell, that's kind of where this kind of presentation, at least with our providers, comes from. And then what I always end on, I'll just include this. This is information pulled from CalAIM, which I know there's crossover. So I did pull some direct examples of some of the services that they had, which might cross over into CYBHI in different ways. But I just have it as a reference in case you'd like to have that. So I will pass it back to you, Patrick. We'll end my station.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda.